Champions Chess Tour started today, February 18th, 2025. It's an online tournament, 16 participants, including 8 of the top 10 grandmasters in the world, including Magnus Carlsen, Nakamura, Caruana, Nepomniachtchi, Giri, Alireza, Esipenko, Prague. Time control, each player gets 10 minutes for the whole game without increments. And Alireza, like
Yeah, I mean, I like it a lot, but I know that there are some of my colleagues that some of my older colleagues that don't like it so much. So, but for me, it's really good, and it's like the best time format I could get.
let's take a look at some games. Magnus Carlsen started the tournament with the match against the very talented young Russian grandmaster Andrei Esipenko. And in the very first game, he played with 95.7% accuracy, so showing his championship form. He starts the game with the move d4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, and knight f4. Very popular these days, Jobava London system. c5, active move for black in this position. e3, supporting the pawn on d4. Esipenko exchanges the pawns on d4 and plays a6, not allowing white pieces to get into a square b5. Magnus develops the knight on f3. Esipenko does the same on c6, and Magnus puts his knight in the middle of the board in the central square e5. Esipenko develops the bishop on d7, and Magnus plays his knight on the square e2, potentially defending the pawn on d4 and also preparing the move c3. e6, allowing the black square bishop to get into the game. c3, exchange of the knights on a square e5. Now the knight on f6 is under attack by the pawn, and the knight goes to e4. 11 moves into the game, and Esipenko doesn't have any problems in this opening, so the opening went very well for him. f3, knocking out the knight from square e4, but also weakening the position of the king. Knight goes to c5, and Carlsen puts his knight on a square d4. Queen b6, attacking the pawn on b2. Carlsen protects it with the move queen d2, and Esipenko puts his rook on an open file c, rook c8. Magnus responds with the same, rook c1, bishop e7 preparing short castle. White does the same, castle, castle, f6. Typical pawn break to get the open file for the rook on f8. Rook goes to c2, protecting the pawn on b2, so the queen can move, because now the queen couldn't move, because the pawn on b2 would have been under attack. Bishop goes to e8, very smart maneuvering by Esipenko, putting his bishop on a much better diagonal on a square g6. Queen e3, bishop g6 attacking the rook on c2, the rook moves away to d2, exchange of the pawns on e5, and again this position is very pleasant for black. They have an open file for the rook, they have a beautiful light square bishop, they have a very nice active knight on c5, and the queen is positioned very well as well. Rook goes to e8 and knight goes to b3, pinning the knight c5. So now the knight cannot take on b3 because the queen would be under attack. Esipenko moves the queen away to c6, exchange of the knights on c5. Carlsen doesn't blunder the queen and moves the bishop to d4, blocking the black bishop, exchange of the bishops on d4, and queen goes to c7. g3, e5, sacrificing the pawn on d5. It wasn't really necessary to do this, but Esipenko figured that this would give him the best chance to at least not lose this position, and the sacrifice of the pawn is temporary because queen takes d5 check and bishop goes to f7 and now attacks the queen, and as soon as the queen moves away, Esipenko would take the pawn on a2. Exchange of the queens on d6, and the bishop takes the pawn on a2. And everything would have been okay, except for the fact that Carlsen is probably the best ever at endgames. Before that title, unofficial title, belonged to Capablanca, I'm sorry. But now I'm sure that Carlsen is number one ever to play the endgames. To go into an endgame position with him is usually a chess suicide, and basically that was proven in this game. Double down the rooks on d file, rook f7, king gets into the action, king f2, king s3, bishop attacks the rook on d1, Carlsen moves it away on d2, bishop goes to a4, not to allow white to get into a square d7, bishop d3, attacking the pawn on h7, bishop c6, attacking the pawn on f3. That's actually a serious threat. Therefore, bishop e4, exchange of the bishops on e4. This position is clearly better for white. They have active rooks, they have active king. The pawn on e5 is very weak. It's not supported by other black pawns. So eventually it would be captured by white, and Carlsen, with his absolutely fabulous endgame technique, easily wins this game after a series of moves that we're not gonna get into details right now, but this position is easily winning for a player of this caliber as Magnus Carlsen. From after rook e6, cannot exchange the rooks because the pawn on e5 would be taken with the king, and with extra pawn the king endgame is very easy. So therefore rook goes to f7, king takes the pawn on e5, and in this position Esipenko resigned because, let's say, in some variation, for example, rook takes f3, rook e7 check, the king will go away, rook takes b7, and the pawn c will queen on a square c8. Or if Esipenko stays on the 7th rank, let's say rook c7, protecting still the pawn on b7, then simply king d6, attacking the rook, and the rook has to move away, and after rook e7, the pawn on b7 falls, and Magnus Carlsen wins the game. As I mentioned, it's a match format, so there is another game between Esipenko and Carlsen. This particular game was not played as accurate as the previous one, only 76% accuracy for Esipenko and 82% accuracy for Magnus Carlsen. Esipenko starts with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. We have Ninja Indian defense, very popular these days on grandmaster level. Knight goes to f3, all theory, b6, allowing the bishop to develop through the square b7 or a6. Esipenko plays e3, bishop goes to b7, bishop d3, occupying a very nice b1 h7 diagonal for Esipenko. Short castle, c5, trying to undermine white center, very typical instructive move. Knight goes to a4, with some ideas to trap the black square bishop with the move a3. Therefore, c takes d4, e takes d4, and bishop takes f3. Not the move I would make for black in this position, and the engines kind of agree with me. The bishop, light square bishop for black is really good, so exchange it for a knight was not really recommended, but obviously no argument with Magnus Carlsen, one of the best to ever play this game. He knows what he is doing. After queen takes f3, the rook is under attack, so Magnus develops the knight on c6, protecting the rook at the same time. Bishop goes to d3 because the pawn on d4 was under attack, so now it has to be protected. e5, very typical move in this position, again to undermine white center. In this position, Esipenko should have played a very logical move, d5, attacking the knight, but for some reason he decided to play the move a3. Not sure if he miscalculated something or just misjudged the position, but d5 would have given him a large advantage, and a3 immediately equalized the game, because after e takes d4 and bishop f4 and bishop e7, black simply have an extra pawn. It's doubled, but it's still an extra pawn, and no big problems positionally either. Before starting some activity on the queen side of the board, Magnus puts his rook on an open file e. Esipenko answers the same with rook e1. Bishop goes on f8, offering the exchange of the rooks, but Esipenko plays more aggressively and starts attack on the king side of the board with the move g4. Rook goes to c8 for Magnus, c5, exchange on c5 didn't happen because Esipenko plays aggressively g5, attacking the knight on f6. The knight has to go away, but first Magnus decides to exchange the rooks on e1, and now the knight goes back to e8. Magnus' position looks pretty passive, with most of his pieces on the last rank, but there is nothing concrete here for white. Bishop c4. And actually, this position already white is considerably better because of the weak pawn on f7. Black has to sacrifice the pawn. They move to d5. Bishop takes d5. Queen goes to d7, protecting potentially the pawn on f7. Esipenko puts the knight on an active square on c5, attacking the queen. Magnus cannot really stand this knight on c5 for too much longer, and immediately takes it with the bishop. B takes c5, and knight goes to e7, which is a critical mistake by Magnus. And in this position, Esipenko was easily winning with the move bishop takes f7, sacrificing temporarily the bishop. King would take on f7, bishop d6, discovery check from the queen, and let's say king g6, rook takes e7 with absolutely dominant position and an extra pawn, weak king, and totally winning position. Very surprisingly that Esipenko didn't find that move with still 6 minutes to go on the clock. Instead, he moved his bishop away to b3, still having a better position, but not as winning as it was a move ago. Rook takes c5. That's another mistake by Magnus that Esipenko didn't take advantage of. He moved his queen to e4, which looks logical because now both knights are kind of under attack. But king f8 protects the knight on e7. Queen takes h7, and that was already a mistake by Esipenko. And the reason it's a mistake, because after a very clever move, knight g6, it turns out that white attack is going nowhere. The queen is not attacking the black king and really doesn't have many moves at all. So the attack kind of ended without starting. The bishop on f4 is not under attack because if you take the bishop, there would be actually a checkmate. So white plays h3, and the reason they play h3 because black wanted to move their queen on g4 with the check and take the bishop. Rook c3, attacking both the bishop and the pawn on h3. Esipenko plays a very nice looking move, bishop e6. And now after pawn takes e6, he takes the knight on g6. His position is slightly better still, because the black king is still not safe. The bishop on f4 is much more active and better piece than the knight on e8. But Magnus plays queen f7. He wants to exchange the queens. Obviously, Esipenko doesn't want to exchange the queens because the endgame would be lost with the extra pawn for black. So he goes queen e4, sacrificing the pawn on h3, but taking the pawn on d4. Not much time left for each player here, 2 minutes each. Magnus plays queen f5, bishop g3, takes the pawn on g5, queen b4, check. The king moves away to g8, and last mistake of the game, a rook takes e6, takes the pawn on e6. That's a mistake because rook takes g3, sacrificing the rook. Esipenko resigns. The reason he resigns because he loses the rook on e6 after he takes the black rook, queen takes g3, and no matter where the king goes, the next check is from h3, and nice geometry, check and double attack, and winning the rook back. And black would have an extra piece, and Esipenko resigned, and Magnus Carlsen won the match and advanced to the next round. Hikaru Nakamura, one of the top American grandmasters, was playing a match with Jan Nepomniachtchi, the top Russian grandmaster, and surprisingly, Nakamura easily beat Nepomniachtchi. Let's take a look at a couple of their games. Nepomniachtchi goes e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6. We have two knights defense. One of the variations that lead to a lot of complicated theory is knight g5, attacking the pawn on f7, but it's rarely played on a grandmaster level. Usually the game goes a lot slower. d3, h6, c3, preparing the breakthrough on d4. Bishop goes to c5, developing on a nice diagonal. b4, attacking that bishop. Bishop goes back to e7, a4. Nepomniachtchi is extending his pawns. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. In this particular case, he overextended his pawns, and Nakamura took advantage of that. Castle, castle, d6. Nakamura wants to develop the bishop, either to e6 or g4. a5. Nepomniachtchi continues to expand on the queen side of the board. Nakamura offers exchange of the bishops that Nepomniachtchi accepts on square e6, and after queen b3, he is attacking the pawn on e6. It had to be protected, and Nakamura protects it with the move queen d7. h3, luft for the king, and also not allowing any black pieces to go on g4 in some variations. b6, undermining white pawns on the queen side of the board. Bishop went to e3. d5, break, pawn break in the center. Now if white takes on d5 after e takes d5, Nakamura would have doubled his pawns, and with this great pawn center would have a big advantage. Therefore, Nepomniachtchi doesn't take the pawn, but instead develops the knight on a square d2. Bishop d6, exchange of the pawns on b6, and b5, attacking the knight on c6. Nakamura goes to a5 and attacks the queen. The queen has to move away and moves away to a square b1. And Nakamura plays a rook e8. Now the rook doesn't have to do anything, has nothing left to do on this a file. He moves it on a e file. because in some variations it would be useful to have it here. Rook e1, queen f7, rook a4, there's some maneuvering going on, maneuvering of the pieces, and now attacking the queen goes back to f7, rook e2, king h8, queen a2, strange looking move, queen g8, knight goes to h2. As I mentioned, the players are just maneuvering their pieces, and the action will come a little later. After knight goes to b7, rook a7. So something already active starting. The knight is under attack, but black plays the move rook a8, taking control of the a file. Now you cannot take the knight on b7 because white is going to lose the queen. Therefore, exchange of the rooks on a8, and that's why maybe the queen on g8 was actually a very smart move, because you see it protects the rook on a8, and black has a file in their possession, file A. Queen is under attack, it has to go away, and Nepomniachtchi moves the queen to b1. A rook goes to a3, attacking the pawn on c3. One of the rules of chess is active pieces are more important than material in many cases. Therefore, Nepomniachtchi decides to give up the pawn on c3, but instead take control of the a file for the rook. Rook takes c3. Black has an extra pawn, but at least white has some activity on the a file. Knight f3, d4. White position is getting suffocated. Bishop goes all the way back to c1. Considerable advantage for black, especially after the move knight to c5. Knight is in a great square on c5. Pawn on d3 is under attack. Nepomniachtchi has to make another unpleasant move. Knight e1, protecting the pawn on d3. Rook goes to b3, attacking the queen and the pawn on b5. Nepomniachtchi blocks with rook b2, exchange of the rooks on b2, and knight goes to a5. All black pieces are positioned really well. The queen will get into the game soon. White pieces are lowered all over the place without much purpose. This knight is defending the pawn on d3. The knight on g3 does absolutely nothing. The bishop on f1 and on c1 is not doing much. The queen is out of the game. Nepomniachtchi plays bishop d2, knight b3, bishop b4, and queen e8, noticing that the pawn on b5 cannot be defended. Nepomniachtchi exchanges the pieces on c5. Now the queen at least defends the pawn on b5, and plays h4. And Nakamura takes control of the a file with the queen e8, king h2, and transfer of the bishop to a better diagonal and attacking the pawn on h4. Knight f3, protecting the pawn on h4, but allowing black to take on d3. Nakamura doesn't take on d3, although he definitely could. It wasn't a mistake. But he plays bishop f6 to protect the pawn on e5. Knight goes to h5, queen e8. Nepomniachtchi went to knight h5. Everybody thought with the idea to take the bishop on f6, which would be a very logical move. But instead, he decides not to do it and plays g4. He does protect the knight, but the move doesn't make much sense because after queen g6, the pawn on g4 is immediately under attack. Nepomniachtchi has to defend it with an awkward-looking move, king g3. Now Nakamura takes the pawn on d3, attacking the queen. The queen moves away to e2, and Nakamura just moves his knight away to a square c5. His position is totally winning, but with just over a minute left on the clock for both opponents, Obviously, you need to play this till the end, because things can happen. Pawn on e4 is under attack as well. Therefore, knight d2 protecting the pawn on e4. Bishop goes to e7, queen f3, king g8 getting into the action, queen e2. White doesn't have really any plan in this position, so they're waiting. Queen f7, king h3, bishop d6, again some maneuvering of the pieces. Knight goes to a more active square on c4, and here comes d3 attacking the queen, and the pawn d is getting more and more dangerous. Queen e3, g6, now attacking the knight. The knight has only one move to g3, queen a4, queen f4, offering the exchange of the queens. If Nepomniachtchi takes the offer and exchanges the queens, his position is immediately lost, so he decides to keep the queens on the board with the move queen e1. Knight goes to b3, d2 is on the way, queen d1, attacking the knight on b3, so d2 immediately is not possible because the knight is under attack. Knight goes back, queen e1, king g7, h5, trying to create some play on the king side of the board, but g5 blocks every attempt. King g2, and Nakamura just starts taking pieces. Pawns in this case, queen takes g4. Queen a1 attacking the pawn on e5. Nakamura has to be careful not to allow that to happen, therefore he moves the queen back to f4. Queen a8 and d2. And now it turns out that the queen has to move all the way back to protect the protection square, promotion square point on d1. Therefore, another pawn is taken. Knight takes e4, knight takes e6, and a checkmate. Queen f2. In this position, Nepomniachtchi resigned because after his next move, there is a checkmate. The most interesting match of the day was between the best American chess player Fabiano Caruana and Alireza Firouzja, Iranian grandmaster representing France. This match went the distance, and let's take a look at a couple of games. Caruana is playing white, starts with e4, that's the first game of the match. e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, and we have 4 knights game. h3, that's for the future. When white castle, they will have a loop for the king, and again, as we discussed before, g4 square is important to make sure that black pieces don't get there, especially the bishop. Bishop goes to b4 instead. Bishop d3 seems like totally anti-positional move because the pawn on d2 is stuck, the bishop on c1 is stuck, but again, with engines, computer engines, this move is not considered a mistake anymore, as it would have been like 30 years ago, because white developed their pieces in a certain way that we're going to take a look later. Castle, castle, d6 to allow the bishop into the game. Knight goes to e2, rook e8, c4, taking control of the square d5. Bishop goes to c5. Now bishop c2. So you see how they're developing. Bishop d3, bishop c4, bishop c2, knight e2. So all these moves, and it's still okay for white. a5, taking control of the square b4. a3, h6, luft for the king. d3. Again, kind of anti-positional game for white, it seems like. Because the white light square bishop is totally blocked by its own pawns and doesn't look good at all. Computer actually agrees. 11 moves into the game, and black position is not worse. So they equalized very easily here. I guess Caruana's plan was not to gain any advantage in the opening, but to get to just a playable position and decide the game in the middle game. Bishop d7 developing, bishop e3 offering the exchange of the bishops. Firouzja didn't want to take on e3 because after f takes e3, white would have a dangerous open file f. So Firouzja went b6, knight g3 potentially going to f5. Knight goes to h7. In this move, usually the idea of this move is to eventually play f5 and open the position and start attack on the king side of the board. Bishop a4, knight e7, and d4. And now, finally, white has what they want to achieve. They finally achieved it. Very nice pawn center. So after d4, you have to take it because there was nowhere to put the bishop. Knight takes d4, knight f8, exchange of the bishops on d7, b3, knight c6, offering multiple exchanges on d4. But knight goes to the other side of the board, knight f5, and now white's position is considerably better because they have a very strong knight on f5, and a very nice diagonal that would determine the outcome of this game. Rook goes to e6. Black wants to probably play the rook to square g6 to protect the pawn on g7 and also start some attack on the white king. And here, bishop d2, very smart move. Caruana transferring his bishop to a great diagonal. King h7, bishop c3. Now the pawn on g7 is already under attack, and white's position is dominant. g6 is pretty much the only move, attacking the knight. Knight goes back to h4. Queen e7, still harassing that knight. Knight has to go all the way back to f3. Rook b8, preparing some counter attack on the queen side of the board. Queen goes to the center square d5, and no black piece can actually bother the queen on d5. Queen e8, protecting the knight on c6. Rook b1, preparing the move b4, but that was actually not necessary, and white had to play on the king side of the board. So rook b1 was not the best move in this position. b5, that was the plan all along, and b4. That was probably why rook b1 was played, to answer b5 with the move b4. Exchange of the pawns on b4. Bishop goes away to b6. Fabiano Caruana attacks that bishop with the move c5. Pawn take. Bishop goes to a7. Thankfully for black, there is a knight on c6 who protects that bishop on a7. But knight goes to d4. Great square, attacking the rook. Knight goes to e7. The queen is under attack now. The queen has to move away. It moved away to b3. The pawn on b5 is hanging. Bishop takes c5. And here in this position, black decided it would be better to sacrifice the exchange, because otherwise their position would be totally lost, as the bishop on a7 is under attack and the rook on e6 is under attack. So both pieces are under attack. You cannot protect both, obviously. it's better to lose the exchange and not the whole piece. So bishop takes c5, knight takes c6, knight takes c6. White has an extra exchange for the pawn, but this position is not so clear. White definitely have an advantage, but black has their own chances. Rook d1, bishop b6, bishop f6, and knight goes to g8 attacking the bishop. The bishop goes away to b2. Again, this diagonal is just absolutely monstrous. c5, knight goes to e2, c4, showing some activity for Alireza. Bishop is great, actually. The pawns are connected, they look dangerous. But after queen c3, it turns out that there is a checkmate on h8. And that's a threat, obviously a serious threat, and the most logical move here would be, let's say, f6 to block the diagonal. So instead, in this position, Alireza, with 1 minute and 26 seconds on the clock, which is an eternity for the guy like Alireza, plays queen c6. Yeah, he did play queen c6 and allowed a checkmate in one move. Yes, grandmasters make those type of mistakes also, like all of us humans. So queen h8, checkmate. So that was the win of for Caruana. He led the match 1-0, and then the match became 2-2. And in the decisive game of this match, Fabiano played again white, Firouzja played black. In this particular game, Caruana didn't have his best game at all. He only played at 78% accuracy, which is a very bad result for a grandmaster of his level. He started the game with d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, e3, c5, so-called Krause variation. Exchange takes the pawn on c5, e6, attacking the pawn with the bishop. And you can treat this position differently for white, but Caruana decided to hang on to this pawn on c5 and protect it with the move b4, not the best move in this position at all. That's all theory in move, that's move 5, obviously Caruana knew what he was doing, but that's not the best move at all. Immediately a5, undermining white's pawn structure. Now if you take on a5, bishop would simply take on c5, black position is much better. You also cannot play a3, because after this take, you cannot take back, as your rook would be under attack. So the only good move in this position is c3, exchange of the pawns, and another undermining of white pawn structure, the move b6. Bishop b5 check, exchange of the bishops on d7, a4, extending the pawns on the queen side of the board without castle. Caruana is not playing his best chess at all. B takes c5, b5. Those pawns look dangerous. They're connected passing pawns. But in reality, black's position is better. They play bishop d6, simply developing the bishop. White do the same. They develop the bishop on a nice diagonal. Rook a7. The purpose of this move is to allow the queen to get to a8 and start pressuring on a file, the pawn on a4. Castle, queen a8, bishop goes to c3. The reason for this move, because white wants to play a5, and if they would be allowed to play a5, their position would be already better, as these pawns would be very, very dangerous. Therefore, bishop c7, taking control of the square a5. Knight develops to d2, castle, queen c2, and e5. Black has a absolutely monstrous pawn center. Knight goes to h4 with the idea to put it on a nice square f5. Rook e8, knight f5, g6, knocking this knight out, and knight goes to g3. So Caruana made 3 moves in a row with the knight. That's not exactly the best use of moves. Bishop a5, offering the exchange of the bishops. Caruana takes the offer. Exchange of the bishop happened, and now the pawn on a4, instead of being a strong pawn, connected passing pawn, becomes a weak pawn because the rook and the queen have to protect it. e4. In this position, white has to do something in the middle of the board to undermine this center. Knight goes to b6, and queen takes c5. Alireza allowed Caruana to take the pawn on c5, because after knight takes d7, the queen goes away. He takes the pawn on a4. Rook went to b1. Caruana decided not to exchange the queens because black would have the a file or all to themselves, and a very, very pleasant position. But after rook b1, rook c8 attacking the queen. Queen goes to d6, still not exchanging the queens. D takes e, queen e7. Caruana trying to create some activity on the king side of the board to get closer to the king, but as you can see, the queen is attacking by itself. There is no support to the queen. The knights are far away, the rooks are far away. Black's game is much easier. They play rook c2, getting into the second rank, attacking the knight on d2. The good news for black that the pawn on e4 is protected. So there is no move, knight takes e4. The knight has to move away, but instead Caruana plays queen g5, protecting the knight with the queen. Again, not always the best way to use your best piece, the queen, to protect your pieces. Queen went to d5, again putting more pressure on the knight on d2. Caruana goes knight f5, and I'm not sure if he miscalculated this position or he decided to just create some confusion, but knight f5 simply blunders a piece, because queen takes d2, and there is nothing threatening the black king in this position. Queen e8 check, knight blocks the check with f8. Now notice that the queen is protected, the black queen. Knight e7 check, king g7, and again, nothing really threatens the black king. So white takes the knight on b6. Maybe that was the whole idea, to get the piece back by taking it on b6, but this position is totally lost, because after e3, you cannot take the pawn with the pawn because there is a checkmate on g2. And if you take it with the queen, then simply after exchanging with the queens, the rooks get into the second rank and devour all the pieces here. So that position is totally lost for white. Caruana continues with knight c6, e2, attacking the rook. The rook moves away to e1, rook b2. There were quicker ways to win this position, but rook b2 is fine. Rook c1, rook c4. That's not a blunder. If rook takes c4, queen takes e1 with a checkmate. Rook goes back to a1, rook a4, some repetition of the moves, queen e3. Now, if in this position Caruana went back to c1, the winning move is simply queen takes c1, rook takes c1, and rook d2, sacrificing the queen temporarily, So white has an extra queen, but there is no defense from the move a rook d1 check. Rook d1 check and queen on e1. Therefore, Caruana played queen e3, rook takes a1, queen e5 check, and after king h6, Caruana resigned and lost the match. The reason he resigned, he simply has no moves. If he takes the rook on a1, then queen d1, same idea as before. It's basically checkmate. So this doesn't work. The pawn on e2 you cannot take because it's your rook is pinned. So the game over, and Caruana lost the match to Firouzja. So let's take a look what happened today. Magnus Carlsen beat Andrei Esipenko 3-1. Wesley So, another American grandmaster, lost to Chinese grandmaster Yu Yangui 1.5 to 2.5. One of the top rated players in the world, Arjun Arigasi, beat Russian grandmaster Artemiev 2.5 to 1.5. Chinese grandmaster Wei Yi beat Pragnananda. Hikaru Nakamura easily beat Russian grandmaster Grishuk 2.5 to 1/2. Jan Nepomniachtchi, Russia beat best Polish grandmaster Jan Krzysztof Duda 3-1. Fabiano Caruana easily beat Sam Sevian 2.5 to 1/2 point. Alireza Firouzja beat Anish Giri from Netherlands 2.5 to 1/2. In the second round, Magnus Carlsen beat Yu Yangui 2.5 to 1/2. Arjun Rigasi played against Wei Yi, beat him 3-0, and in one of the games really didn't have a fair play situation there, because in a totally drawing position with the king and the pawn against the king, he just decided to win on time. Not sure if it was the right thing to do, but by the rules it's allowed, so he did win on time in a totally draw position where you couldn't really make any progress. So he beat Wei 3-0. Nakamura, as we discussed, easily beat Nepomniachtchi 3-0, which was a surprise, not that Nakamura won, but the ease with which he won. And Caruana and Alireza, as we discussed, had a fabulous match, and Alireza beat Caruana 3-2. So in the semifinals, Magnus Carlsen will play Arjun Erigaisi from India, and Hikaru Nakamura, USA, will play Alireza Firouzja, France. Thank you for watching.